Now let's have a look at a different way of defining functions. We right now always use the function keyword, no matter if we use the expression syntax, which we have here, or if we use the declaration syntax, which we used earlier, where you just had function, sum function, and so on, right? So that were the two ways we used to create functions. Now, whenever you have an anonymous function, you can also use a different syntax. And for that syntax here, let's start with getWinner. You can remove the function keyword, and now we would get an error. But now you add, between the parameter list and the function body, you add an equal sign and a greater than sign. So that looks like an arrow here, right? It's an equal sign and a greater than sign without a white space in between. That would be a syntax error, so there must not be any white space between. And this is now a special keyword in the end, understood by JavaScript, has nothing to do with the assignment operator or the greater than operator. So this combined is a new keyword just made up of, well, mathematical signs, I guess. And this constructs a so-called arrow function. And I guess you can see where the name is coming from. So what's special about such an arrow function? Well, obviously, we build it in a different way. There also is only this expression syntax. So where you could use function, sum function like this, there's no equivalent for arrow function. So you can't define an arrow function like this. I mean, you can, but it's not doing anything. It has no name. You can't assign a name to it. You always have to store it in some variable or use it in a place where you would use an anonymous function. So it's an anonymous function where you can't assign a name in any way. So you always use it on the right side of the equal sign or in places like down here with the event listener. So whenever you need to pass in a function and whenever you can use an anonymous function. So that's of course one striking difference, and this might sound more like a disadvantage than an advantage. Well, the advantage is it's a bit shorter, you save the extra function keyword, and obviously that's not much to type, but it's a bit shorter. But in addition to that, this function syntax has some extra tricks up on its sleeve. Now, there's one neat behavior which we'll only understand a bit later related to objects and how arrow functions can help us there. So we'll come back to that later. But even without object and without that thing, there already are some nice things we can do with it. For example, you can shorten this code here in a very convenient way when using such an arrow function. Let's write this code as a ternary expression. And that's kind of borderline because it will be a rather long and a bit nested ternary expression, but you can do it. So you could write a ternary expression, which you immediately return, so where you return the result, where you make this comparison, like that. And if that's true, you obviously return result draw, right? That's how a ternary expression works. Condition, then your result if that is true. And then an else case, and now in that else case, we add yet another ternary expression, so yet another condition, which is this longer condition. And as I said, this will be a bit of a longer ternary expression, but still should be okay. So let's add this condition here, and then another question mark for the case that this condition is met, and that would be result player wins. And then a colon with the else case, so if that condition here is false, and that's result computer wins. Now add a semicolon, and we can now also comment out this if-else block. Now don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that block. I just want to show you something. So let's auto-format this code. Already makes it much more readable. And now we have this code. Now, I wouldn't argue that this is a bit more readable, but this is also still fine. Shouldn't be too hard to understand what's going on here. Now, where's the advantage? Well, if you have a function, an arrow function, where you only have one expression in it, you can actually omit the curly braces, so you can get rid of that. And also, you then have to omit the return keyword. So you can write this entire function in the end like this here, right? It's automatically restructured in a new line, but this continues here after the arrow. This belongs to the function. So this is as if it would be in one long line. Gets even clearer if we quickly add another function, which we don't need here. Let's say an add function, which also takes a and b as arguments. Then you could write this as just a plus b. The equivalent, add to, with the function keyword would be that you have to write a, b, and then in here return a plus b. Now, that's not that much longer, but this here certainly is shorter. And especially in places where you just need to pass an anonymous function to quickly do some calculation, this is way shorter than if you have to write this. Now, as always, it's not like this being awfully wrong, but saving some code, and therefore saving some time writing code, is never a bad idea in JavaScript. So along with other advantages, which we'll fully understand later, the availability of extra syntactical sugar like this, where we can shorten this function, is definitely nice to have. Now there's more we can do with that arrow function. So for arrow functions, the general syntax is this one. You have your list of arguments. Of course, you don't need to accept any, but if you do, then you write it like this. Then this arrow, and then your function body. Now, in cases where you have no arguments, you write this like this. You have to have your empty pair of parentheses here. You must not omit this. So this is required. This is how you would write this function if it gets no arguments. Now, a nice other feature, which I haven't shown you yet, is if you get exactly one argument, not two, not none, but one, then you can write it like this. So then you can omit the parentheses. Again, saving some extra code that needs to be written. So parentheses can be omitted in this case. You also can add them, but you also can omit them. Now, if you have exactly one expression in the function body, that's what I just showed you, then you can write it like this. You can omit the curly braces. You don't have to, but you can. If you omit them though, you also must remove any return keyword or any return statement you had in there, and the result of this calculation will then always be returned. So even if you have an expression in there where you're not interested in the return value, it still will be returned. That might not be a problem, it's just something to be aware of. There always is an invisible return keyword in front of that part after the arrow, so in front of your function body. And also keep in mind, this only is allowed if you have exactly one expression on the right side, so one expression that yields some kind of value. If you have an if statement in there, so anything which wouldn't work after a normal equal sign, that won't work here as well. So if you have more than one expression in the function body, you have to add curly braces, and of course you would write this over multiple lines. I'm just running out of space on this slide, so you would write your code as normal in the other functions as well. So the curly braces and a return statement, if you need one, is required. It's not implicitly returned, and you can't omit the curly braces. So that are arrow functions. Again, they also have one other advantage, which we'll see later. But even without that advantage, it's quite nice to have them because of all that potential for saving some code. And saving one character here or there might not sound like a big deal, but overall it reduces the time you need to write code, giving you more time to think about the real problems you want to solve with your code. And it also leads to shorter code, which often is easier to skip through, easier to read. Not always, but often. So therefore I will actually heavily use arrow functions here, but you don't have to do that. It's again up to you which syntax you prefer. I'm personally a fan of arrow functions here, and here therefore I will convert all these functions to arrow functions. So by removing the function keyword and then adding the arrow between the parameter list and the function body. As you learned, here if you take no arguments, if you have no parameters, you need that empty pair of parentheses. So with that, let's also remove it here and add an arrow here in the anonymous function in the event listener. Auto format everything, and yeah, that's looking good. Arrow functions everywhere.